Welcome to Wood Stuff with Hutch. Today I'm going to be turning a large 7-foot western red cedar porch post. And so I'm starting with a large 8-foot piece that's 6 inches by 6 inches. And of course, before I can do the turning, I got to mill this because it has 2 square ends. And, getting it through the joiner here is a little bit of a trick. Weighs about 60 pounds, and I definitely have to use in-feed and out-feed rollers to manhandle it. And then after I surface one side on the joiner, go to the planer and I plane it down to the finished thickness, which is 4 3/4 inches. And after doing that process, I go back to the joiner and use that one of the flat faces against the fence in order to square up the other edges to those faces. And it's a pretty challenging operation here because it's so heavy and I gotta somehow keep that face flat against the fence. But with a little muscle and elbow grease, I was able to get it done. After I'm done with that, I go to the table saw where I rip off the excess. I think I did about, took off about 3/4 of an inch instead of having to run it through the planer so many times. And you can see with the extra weight, I kind of had a bobble there and tipped it up, but luckily nothing bad happened. And I'm using a 24 tooth dedicated ripping blade on this, and seemed to work pretty well. Now, one thing I haven't talked about with this piece is the fact that this is not a kiln dried piece. It is carrying a ton of water weight. And this water weight's going to cause a lot of problems with the turning, as you'll see later. It's going to affect the speed, the cut, all those kinds of things. But before we get to that, here I am doing a cross-cutting operation to cut it to length, trying to cut out the knots. And because it's so large and heavy, you'll notice in order to make sure that everything is done safely, I put a board across some rollers to support the piece as I do this cross-cutting operation. And here I'm at my big lathe. The only way that I have to really safely and securely center and attach this workpiece to my lathe is with a screw chuck. So I have a 3-inch diameter screw chuck, and I'm just drilling a pilot here for the screw to be able to thread into. And you see here what I'm talking about, and it doesn't want to start, but eventually I do get it screwed on completely. And I just fire up the lathe after I get it mounted just to make sure that it's spinning well. And here I am getting started after marking some things and using the skew to incise the shoulders where I'm going to be turning the round section that's in the middle. Both ends are going to remain square, and so I kind of got to define exactly where I'm going to be doing the turning. Now that I've got that defined, I can bring in my roughing gouge and go ahead and just take this center section right down to a cylinder. And one thing that's kind of a challenge with this project is with the uneven water weight, I have to spin this piece at a very, very slow RPMs. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I mean, it is slow. So this creates a lot of difficulties. And one of the reasons I have to do this and run it so slow is because if I run it faster, that water weight is going to force a large swoop while it's spinning, and I won't be able to get anything concentric. And here I am with the calipers, just taking this to a perfect cylinder, making sure that it's all the same diameter. And with the large skew, I come in and do a peel cut, taking off the excess, and then after this I come back and do a smoothing cut with a shear cut, and you can see here it's ready to mark out for the actual turned elements. And I just use a set of dividers. What you can't see here, Behind me is a porch post that I'm duplicating the elements of, but it has to be scaled differently. And so this is kind of like a modification of something that's existing on somebody's home. And I'm using the calipers again here with the parting tool, and you can see the struggle I'm having. It's really jerky, a lot of catching, and this is because with the wetness of the wood and the speed that it's turning, it's kind of just shredding the wood. And now I've gotten into some cove cutting here, and there's a bead in the center of the cove, so I've got to define that, start cutting away the excess material around that bead so that I can actually shape it and bring it to form. And here I am just doing some more refined cuts. The first cuts were just kind of rough and haggard. And here I am really cleaning it up, making that curve really smooth and incising around that bead. And here I'm just marking the center of the bead to make sure that I don't go too far and kind of know where I'm at so I can keep it symmetrical. And I'm just taking some nice delicate finishing cuts here to bring that bead into its final shape, and so there's not as much tear out, and even though it still is kind of wanting to fuzz on me given how wet it is. Again, here I am using the skew trying to clean up some of those fuzzies that it's creating and trying to shear the fibers as best I can, but here I go to a little bit of a peel cut again. Now I move on to some of the other elements and start defining those. Again, starting with the V-cut made by the skew and then bringing in the spindle gouge to make the beads and coves. And returning to the skew, I use the heel of the blade to be able to come in, clean up that shoulder, and then use the point to shear it off and make a nice clean joint there between that flat element and the bead. Once again, using the skew to define more beads. And now I come in with the spindle gouge, and I do beads like this when there's several in a row or several close together. I will do all of one side and then switch over and do the second side. So as I'm facing the lathe here, it's the right side of the bead, and once that's done and it's kind of roughed in, you might say, then I return and do the other side. And once I do the left side, I come back and do a bunch of refining cuts to really make sure the shapes are symmetrical and that the beads are essentially the same width. And even though there's going to be a little variation, you got to make sure they look as good as you can get. Now it's time to move on to the other end. And here, once again, going through the same processes. Nothing new here, but you'll see here as we go through kind of like a time lapse, the shapes really start to form. And it's not the exact same shapes that were on the other end, so it is a little different. And here I just stopped the lathe to check on my progress, see how things are going. and looks pretty good. So here I'm going to then move on to the center section, and I waited to the end to do this instead of going, say, left to right or right to left, because after I was done with the top and the bottom, I could center this exactly in the remaining portion. Again, stopping the lathe, checking my progress, and that'll work. Some of the fuzziness and things I can clean up with the sandpaper. And now comes the most difficult part of the process. Here I have to turn a pommel, which is where you cut a shape from a square portion down to the round. And in this case, it's an ogee shaped pommel, which means it has reversing curves. Now that in itself is not the difficult part. The reason this process is so difficult is because the lathe is turning very slow, and you're turning a lot of air because you just have the points of the wood hitting your tool. And the problem with that is, in order to maintain smooth curves and a nice even shape, it takes a lot of control and is very difficult. The points, when they contact the tool, shove it back or want to shove it back, and so you have to really have just the right angle so that it cuts and doesn't bump your tool and create a really ratty or haggard or ridgy shape. And after some nice slow cuts, I stopped the lathe to check my progress, and it's not too bad considering, and it's going to be hard to get better than that. So now it's time to move on to the sanding. And in this case, being that this is going to be a painted post, I'm just using 80 grit, and part of the reason is because of the fuzzes that are created by the slow turn rate and the extremely high moisture content of the wood. This allows me to kind of cut through some of those fuzzy fibers and get a clean surface. And here's the finished piece. All I have to do is take it off the lathe and to deliver it to the customer. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.